For some years now, the old era of analogue synths has had somewhat of a comeback. It seems it never grows tired and looks like continuing with all manner of resurrected models or new variations of the humble analogue synth. Now this analogue renaissance is almost taking on mythical proportions, and as one who went through the original analogue era of the 70s upwards, I thought I would do my contribution together with the many other analogue versus digital videos out there. And I promise we won't spend too much time looking at an oscilloscope. That's not where it's at. All through the era of analogue electronics, whether it was tube or transistor technology, where there was a frequency to be generated, there almost always involved the charging and discharging of a capacitor. They were found everywhere there was an oscillator needed, especially in the analogue synthesizers of the 70s. The capacitor's charge and discharge function was responsible for the VCO, portamento and envelope shapers in particular. Now this function of the capacitor had a little quirk that coloured everything it did. In this illustration we can see the behaviour of the capacitor as it is charged and discharged. For the rest of this documentary I will refer to this as the capacitor curve, and it affects a good many of the synthesizer's functions. One of the things that came to my notice about most synths was how the waveforms illustrated on the front panel looked so ideal. The sawtooth had a straight ramp and an instant fall. The square wave was symmetrical and straight. However, when we put an oscilloscope on the synth and open up the filter, we can see how imperfect the real waveforms look. The ramp of the sawtooth was curved like a bow. The fall was more of a steep gradient than an instant. The square was lopsided and the bottom edges sloping. They were not by any means as perfect as they were drawn on the front panel. Now this also slightly colours how the waveforms sound, and every manufacturer had more or less success in making correct waveforms. The first synth I built was a kit by Practical Electronics magazine called the Minisonic, and it was a 2-oscillator synth with a diode ladder filter. I later added a square wave converter with pulse width control. It was the cleanest square wave I could get at that time. Like almost all analogue synths, the sawtooth had a curved ramp, the capacitor curve. Then came my next synth project by the Electronics and Music Maker magazine called the E&M Spectrum. This machine used the Curtis Electromusic chips, which were custom-built chips for synthesizer functions and were ultralinear analogue. This synth made sawtooth waves with straight ramps and hard vertical falls. The square waves were better than my old Minisonic. But now that I had correct looking waveforms, I found they sounded cold and raspy. My oscilloscope showed me they were correct. What had happened? Why did the Minisonic sound warmer? The curve on the sawtooth ramps were in fact adding sine wave harmonics into how they sounded, and the sloping edges of the square waves gave sawtooth harmonics on the squares. What a mess, I thought. How should it really sound? About that time in '83 I bought my first polysynth, a Roland JX3P, which was then followed by a second-hand SH09 and an SH101. Later I acquired a Juno 60 second-hand. I thought at least a major manufacturer would get the waves right, but the results from all of these synths were far from ideal. After a while I stopped chasing the ideal waveform and started to notice that the different synth models I had were better at certain sounds than the others, and some good at basses, some good at string, etc. Really, the waveforms are all about harmonic content for imitating acoustic sounds. By the middle of the 80s came the digital synths with all sorts of synthesis methods. FM, wavetable, vector, linear arithmetic, etc. Waveforms came out of ROM and built mathematically perfect. At last! I went off to the music shops to listen, but I found them hard, metallic and cold compared to my analogues. Crisp and clangy, yes, but not as warm. It then came to my mind that the unlinear imperfection of the analogues is what gave them life. And also, because the analog synths came first, they are what we measured everything else by. Now this test isn't so much about looking at waveforms just for the oscillator's sake, but we're going to look at the tuning when we play several notes. Now we're going to focus on the oscilloscope so that we can see what's happening to the sound. For this test we're going to use one oscillator, both on the Gaia and the Korg Volca. And as you can hear, that's the Gaia, this is the Volca. So there it's just one oscillator, no effects, no reverb, no chorus. Now I'm going to play two notes on the Gaia, the first C and the C an octave up. Note how the waveform is static. The sound is also static. Now I'm going to do that on the Volca. First C and the next C. Oh, it's a running free phase. We'll take another C. Let's do that on the Gaia again. There's nothing free phase about our modern digital instruments. The keyboard tuning is perfect intervals, so perfect that there's no movement in them. We'll listen to that again just for the sake of it. The Gaia. Now we'll listen to the Volca. VCOs are independent generators, they're not phase locked. So they run in and out of phase with each other, and there is the warmth of the VCO as against the DCO or the analog modelling from a computer, which is often tuning perfect. Now this problem with dead perfect tuning is not just a Gaia. I've got a Micro X, that's got dead perfect tuning. An old Motif, that's got dead perfect tuning. A lot of VSTs have got dead perfect tuning as well. I use the Tol Uno 60 and Synth 1, which many people use. And everything to do with VSTs is pretty well dead tuned. The only things that I've found in my collection anyway that are not dead tuned are Martin Luder's PG8X, which is an emulator of the JX synths. And to get that sound you can't have the oscillators dead tuned. So this is quite a warm synth with those running oscillators that are independent of each other. And then there's Analog Lab, Analog Factory, or any of Arturia's emulations. Actually, they have actually got this right. But really, this dead phase tuning is nothing new. In the 40s, the Hammond tone wheel organs were sold as replacements of church pipe organs. But church organs had several pipes to each key, and they had that free phase, warm sound. The tone wheels were all driven on one shaft by one motor. They were in perfect intervals. This gave rise to using double tone wheel constructions for that chorus effect, and then came the Leslie rotating speaker. The whole thing was about getting your ears to be deceived into hearing movement that wasn't there. Now there's one important detail that people often miss about the 80s analog sound, and that's what they were recorded on. Often an 8 or 16 track tape recorder and some form of analog mixer. Now if you look at this diagram, magnetic tape had its own saturation curve and did a whole lot of compression if you drove it hard to the line, like one did as standard practice. because you had to get as much signal on the tape to get away from the noise. This gives a very special characteristic which is hard to achieve in a digital audio workstation with just a compressor whilst mastering. Now, before you all run out and think, oh, we've got to buy a tape recorder now, there's going to be a renaissance of tape. No, get a VST. You can get pretty well this compression effect on a normal digital audio workstation with a VST plugin. Now this is a good question. What do you want to achieve? You can get the sound of analog synths in software like Arturia's Analog Factory or their V collection. But if you want the feel of a really old iconic synth, for example, and the sound of just that model, you're going to have to get a lot of bucks out of your pocket and buy the real thing. Yeah, ask anybody who's got a modern car or a veteran car, a really old car. They like the feel of driving that really old vehicle. It's the same with the analog synths. But if you've got the money and you want that feel as well as the sound, you're going to have to buy the real thing. But don't go buying an analog synth thinking that it will somehow magically recreate somebody else's masterpiece from the 80s. Don't forget that our virtual analogs are swimming in chorus and drowning in echo and reverb for most of their presets. If you take away all those things, they sound pretty dry too. Personally, I would invest in one of the newer analogs rather than get a vintage. Components and chips are much better quality nowadays than the 70s and the 80s. And bear in mind, a 35-year-old synth will be very tired and reliability not the best. Not to mention their prices are sky high for what they are. A Juno 60 is dearer now than when it was new, and a vintage Mini Moog horrendously so. But if you do buy a vintage, be prepared to lay down time repairing it when it needs it. Now this motif is not exactly what you called vintage, but it's old enough now that the keys keep breaking on the thing and I have to open it up every now and again to fix it. But just think now, we have today thousands of synth sounds, digital audio recording, and every effect there is on our computers. We've never had it so good. All that's missing are great musical ideas. Well, that's it for all I have to present. Good luck with finding what you really want.